Welcome to Back Away Slowly, a series that walks with you through mysterious places, ominous folktales, strange creatures, and so on, before taking a deeper look at what these stories can tell us about humankind. Episodes are available in a video format on Patreon. The videos include photos, footage of my own visits to these locations, illustrations, animations, and more. Sources, social links, the shop, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewing discretion is advised. It's the late 2000s, and our cousins were visiting us for a few days, as they would soon be moving states away. Being a rowdy group of kids, the adults had banished us to another floor in a room with a TV. We quickly came upon a relatively new show called Ghost Adventures that just happened to be playing its first episode, covering a backroads bar in Wilder, Kentucky named Bobby Mackey's. Despite the oldest of us barely being old enough to be considered teenagers, and the youngest being out of their toddler years, we all agreed with great enthusiasm to watch the show as a kind of test of courage. Over a series of interviews, the picture was painted of a slaughterhouse, the basement of which contained a well that led to a dark tunnel that was, naturally, used by devil worshippers. A building so full of activity that one of the caretakers supposedly slept with a shotgun while he lived on the premises. Zach Baggins and crew were soon locked in the building, recording whispers, walking into, and running out of, rooms. Zach screaming at ghosts. All of the beats that we've come to expect from Ghost Adventures. The tipping point came when, while in the basement, Zach felt dizzy, describing a burning sensation on his back. The crew lifted the back of his shirt, a pause, then gasps of shock and horror as the camera flew back and forth in spooky green night vision. The chaos rose to a head as Zach began shouting, "What? What is it?" When they finally showed the photo that they took, the audience could see 3 long, clear scratches. The narration claimed that these scratches appeared on camera, but there were so many cuts between different viewpoints and the camera had waved around so quickly that we, the viewers, really didn't see them appear on camera. But that didn't matter. Many of the young cousins leapt from their seats and scrambled from the room in search of their parents, who quickly put an end to our test of courage. Over the years, I began to seek out information about folklore and the paranormal. Bobby Mackey's was always on the periphery of my observations, having been featured in many shows and interviews, but it wouldn't reclaim my attention until an internet series named BuzzFeed Unsolved premiered in February of 2016. I was immediately an avid watcher of the show, and on April 7th, 2017, they visited a very familiar place. It wasn't long after that I was visiting college friends and we drove past the building itself. I whipped around in my seat, asking, wait, was that Bobby Mackey's? No one else in the car knew what I was talking about, so I gave them a brief summary of the general legends surrounding the place. They responded with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but I sat back in my seat, still surprised that I had never known how close the location actually was for so many years of my life. When I started this series, I wanted to explore places that were less discussed. Or, I acquiesced that I would cover more famous places if I could find information that hadn't been covered repeatedly by others. With this location having popped up so frequently in my life, I decided to dig a little to see if there was anything worth sharing that hadn't been repeated 1,000 times already. With access to the Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky libraries, I was able to find a book written at the time of the Pearl Bryan investigation, newspaper scans, an academic paper or two, and more. A member of a Midwest ghost hunting group was also kind enough to allow me to interview them about the bar and their experiences. And lastly, I gathered my own information and recordings from a tour and a few visits. So buckle up for a multi-part miniseries covering the history and hauntings of, quote, the most haunted nightclub in America, Bobby Mackey's. In the fall of 1779, a survivor of the Battle of Braddock's defeat by the name of Colonel James Taylor purchased 5,333 1/3 acres of what was then Virginia land. In April of 1792, His 22-year-old son, James Taylor Jr., and his 3 African-American slaves traveled to the purchased land and began to clear the area along what would become the Licking River, Kentucky. What this actually meant was that James Taylor Jr. stayed in Fort Washington, Cincinnati, across the river, while his 3 slaves, Humphrey, Adam, and Moses, cleared the land. James Taylor Jr. became an important figure in further settling of the Newport-Campbell County area, all on the backs of Humphrey, Adam, and Moses. Newport boomed along the Licking River, the area soon becoming known as Finchtown, complete with a hotel and 2 slaughterhouses. Despite this area's quick rise to success, it was also plagued with tragedy. A Kentucky Post article reports that the strip of land from Monmouth Street to the Licking River saw so many lynchings after the Emancipation Proclamation that the area was called Gallows Gap. There were at least 20 hangings, but only 1 was ever actually legal. As early as 1865, people began to report apparitions as they passed through the region, to the point that, quote, some would wait until a train passed through to venture into this area, so as not to hear the wretched sounds of disembodied souls. On April 1st, 1877, a young woman named Nellie Maloney was aboard her father's boat, the Golden Rule, when the boat caught fire against the Cincinnati bank, directly across from where the Licking River empties into the Ohio River. In an attempt to escape the blaze, Nellie Maloney ended up drowning. Her body never recovered. Soon people began to spot the spirit of a girl along the banks, identifying herself only as Nellie. In 1876, a set of distillery buildings owned by George W. Robinson were constructed along the Licking River. All of these distilleries had permission to dig 3 tunnels that would lead from the distillery building under the railroad tracks and down to the river to dispose of the remnants of the distillery process. It's here that we begin to see the cracks in Bobby Mackey's lore. The legend goes that the building was originally a slaughterhouse, the well in the basement being used to wash away all of the blood and viscera. In truth, the closest building that served any use for slaughtering was a small home several hundred feet south of what would become the club, utilized by a local butcher who provided his services for the residents of Finchtown. This doesn't dismiss the idea of the distillery tunnel being used for nefarious means, as we'll see later. But I don't think that it's unreasonable to theorize that the actual butcher's home was close enough to the distillery, that distillery itself later being used by those that the general public viewed as criminals, added to people's knowledge of the tunnel. This then combined with the unpleasant elements of a slaughterhouse was then linked to the obsessive fear that potential Satanists held in the community. This all finally creates a bloody, nefarious narrative that better fits into all of the dark stories surrounding this area, as is common in local lore. Even if the singular truth of the area is forgotten, the most heinous details are what will be remembered for generations. While actual historical fact can seem boring, I think it's important to set those facts straight for reasons of credibility as well as giving us valuable information of why certain fictional elements persist in spite of legitimate history. Anyways, the large distillery was G.O.W. Robson Jr. & Co., later named Licking Bourbon Distilling Co., even later named Old 76 Distilling Co., produced whiskey. A large warehouse was soon filled to its max capacity of 28,000 barrels. At 10 p.m. on September 4th, 1888, night watchman George Ulrich was making his rounds on the 3rd floor. He turned into the condensing room and was blown back by a blast that collapsed the southern wall of the distillery onto the boiler shed. Although it's a relief that no one else was hurt or killed in this accident, Ulrich did suffer horrific face and neck burns. Jump forward a few years to January 24th, 1907. Night watchman Henry Hampton discovered a fire at about 9 p.m. The blaze quickly spread out of control, jumping to William Mittmiller's saloon and Nestle's drugstore, which was located where Bobby Mackey's is today. Residents quickly answered the cries for help, entering the burning building to carry out furniture and other valuables, only to continue walking, effectively committing thefts of convenience from the 2 burning stores. There was no time and no one to hold the thieves accountable, especially when the fire reached the barrels of whiskey. The barrels exploded like fireworks, obliterating the warehouse. Miraculously, the only death reported was of teenager Louis Berger. He had run towards the explosion from his home on 10th and Columbia, but fell down dead from a heart attack due to previously known heart problems. Despite this catastrophic event, it would be the Prohibition that would close down the old 76 Distilling Co. in 1919, the equipment being sold and the building torn down. This was already quite an incident, but now we're going to shift further down the river to an accident that had a much higher death count. On the 15th of June in 1892, a construction crew was working on a bridge at 11th Street that would connect Covington and Newport. It was just before 11 a.m., and carpenter Murray Reardon was warning foreman Frank Moore that the bridge was at risk of collapse. Despite being laughed off, Reardon was adamant that they were in danger. Though a few men assured him it wasn't necessary, Reardon insisted on retrieving some bolts from the blacksmith's shop. The timber and rod framework had held this far into construction, but Reardon had his doubts, no matter how flippant the other foreman was. Reardon had reached the bank when a crack of timber rang out. Everyone froze as cables snapped, and the structure began to crumble. Reardon and the other men fortunate enough to be on land watched 54 laborers plummet 126 feet into a mess of wood, iron, and water. Stunned in horror, they watched as some men, pinned in as little as a foot under the surface, drowned. As the remaining construction crew came to their senses, workers from the rolling mill responded at the sound of the collapse. They leapt into action, pulling bodies from the water. They managed to find a few men who had sustained minor injuries, but this was a rarity. Mill worker E.A. New braved the waters to swim to a man atop the wreckage, his legs trapped between 2 pieces of iron. The man was, understandably, panicking. Despite his best efforts, New couldn't free the man's leg. The man screamed, "Then by God, cut it off. Take your knife and cut me out. Do something." The wreckage began to move. One of the iron beams that had been pinning the man's leg shot up and clipped the man's chin. The shifting beams forced New to fall back as the beams resettled to trap the man's head and slowly sank. New would later hauntingly recount the man's terrible look of fear as he struggled, before disappearing in the churning water. The injured and dead were loaded onto wagons and taken to a boarding house on Thornton Street, including William and Jack Ruby. Jack had already passed away, but his wife's screams woke 20-year-old William. William said, "Don't cry, Annie. It hurts my head so. Jack's all right, I hope, and I'm not going to die." What William didn't know was that his body no longer contained his stomach or intestines. Annie Ruby stayed to comfort William until he fell unconscious for the last time, never telling him of his own condition or of Jack's passing. A 7-year-old boy carrying a bucket of coffee and a basket of food as lunch for his uncles on the construction crew was thankfully turned away before he could reach the scene. The poor, sobbing boy could only return home, bearing the news of William and Jack's deaths to the rest of the family. 41 people were killed that day. The Inquirer obtusely ran the headline, "False." The intent was to discuss the faulty structure, but it obviously gave the impression that the reports of the incident itself were false. The location of this collapse is only a quarter of a mile from the distilleries, and regular reports began to pop up of disembodied voices and hauntings of nearby businesses, including the buildings and area that would much later house Bobby Mackey's. These were a few examples of how much darkness and supernatural rumors already plagued the area, but I think the scene has been sufficiently set to discuss part of the foundation of the Bobby Mackey lore. Next, we explore one of the most shocking murder cases in Cincinnati Newport history, the murder of Pearl Bryan. At 11 p.m. on the 31st of January, 1896, Fort Thomas resident Josephine O'Brien stiffened as she heard a woman's scream coming from James Locke's farm. She had no way of knowing that the cause of that scream was drastically worse than any of the far more sensible reasons that she had no doubt tried to convince herself of. The next morning, 12-year-old John Hurling decided to cut across Farmer John Locke's old orchard. The unsuspecting boy trailed along the boundary fence and found the headless body of a woman lying in a pool of blood. Hurling wasted no time, immediately finding ranch worker Mike Noonan. Noonan verified the boy's story before retrieving the landowner himself. Mr. Locke then hurried to Fort Thomas to telephone the Newport Police Headquarters. Fortunately, the body had remained untouched as no one else had yet discovered it when Campbell County Sheriff Jewel Plummer, Coroner Tingley, and several other officials arrived. As photographs were taken, it was noted that the body was not wet, despite it raining until 9 p.m. the night before. This meant that the murder must have taken place after 9 p.m., which would be further supported by Mrs. O'Brien's report of a woman's scream. The body itself lay in a ravine, the bush around it telling a terrible story of violent struggle, of a girl desperately fighting for her life, and losing. Her feet rested higher on the bank, her corset open. This positioning had hiked up her skirt, and the vulgarity of her clothing state led officials to believe that a sexual assault had taken place, though this would later be proven false. One of my main sources for this case was the book Pearl Bryan, or The Mysterious Murder of Pearl Bryan, or The Headless Horror, a full account of the mysterious murder known as the Fort Thomas tragedy from beginning to end, full particulars of all detective and police investigations, dialogues of the interviews between Mayor Caldwell, Chief Deitch, and the prisoners, published by Bardet & Co., the same year of the murder. Extensively long title aside, it reported 3 bone-deep cuts in her left hand, chronicling of 3 times that the deceased had grasped at a knife blade in defense. Quote, "The severance was made below the 5th vertebra. Judging by the pool of blood, life had been extinct from 4 to 8 hours when the body was found." A clump of vibrant red hair was also found on the body. The scene around the headless victim was just as shocking, if not more so. The enormous pool of blood, so much blood that it had soaked 3 inches deep into the soil, left no doubt in regards to the scene of the murder. A glove and several torn pieces of her dress hung on nearby bushes. Worse still, blood was found on tree branches as high as 6 feet above her, meaning that the ill-fated girl had certainly been alive at the time of the beheading. The body was put under the care of Undertaker W.H. White and removed from the scene. Unfortunately, word had quickly spread of the gruesome crime, and before police detectives Krim and McDermott could return to process the scene, quote, "Hundreds of persons from the 3 cities and every soldier stationed at Fort Thomas who could possibly get away had preceded them. The grass and bushes were trampled down by the crowds of visitors who had come to satisfy their curiosity. Relic hunters were out in great numbers, and they almost demolished the bush under which the body was discovered, breaking off branches upon which blood spots could be seen. They peered closely into the ground for blood-spotted leaves, stones, and even saturated clay. Anything that had a blood stain upon it was seized upon eagerly, and hairs of the unfortunate woman, examining every branch and twig of the bush in the midst of which the struggle took place, in hope of finding one." This destructive fanaticism would continue for weeks, even after the day of the discovery of the body. The farmer John Locke capitalized on this attention by charging a fee to see the murder site, and the photographs of the crime scene that Locke had taken himself. But eventually, this began to annoy him, as these visitors were trampling his crops. Eventually, he would take their money, and then show them an entirely different spot that was more convenient. In any case, this disgusting display of human curiosity proved predictably catastrophic when Arthur Carter of Seymour, Indiana, brought his famous bloodhounds, Jack, Wheeler, and Stonewall. The dogs were unable to track any consistent leads. The evidence had been handled by so many bystanders, the crime scene trampled by God knows how many meddlers, that it was impossible to sort through scents by the time the dogs arrived. It wasn't long before an anxious crowd hovered outside of Undertaker White's establishment on 4th Street in Newport. Many were hoping to identify the body as a missing friend or family member, and, despite many being permitted to view the body, no confirmed identifications were made. Meanwhile, the crime's details and the body's description began to spread to nearby cities and states. A Mrs. Alexander S. Bryan became uneasy when she heard that the body had small, seamstress-like fingers, including a small wart on a finger. Her daughter hadn't been seen since January 28th, and a telegram sent by Mrs. Bryan's son to his missing sister's friends only confirmed that she was still nowhere to be found. Dr. Roberts Carruthers was charged with carrying out the postmortem. He concluded that the victim couldn't be older than 20, and that she had been 5 months pregnant. Dr. Charles Fithian of Newport would perform another postmortem. He said that she had been, without a doubt, alive when decapitated, since the blood in her body hadn't coagulated. Dr. Fithian said, quote, "The cut on the left hand shows that she fought with her murderer. The cut goes clear to the bone and proves that she did not receive it by making the weak attempt at defense that a person in a semi-comatose condition would have made." The significant clues to the woman's identity lay in her clothes. The dress was light blue, with a white, small pattern check made of cotton. There was also a dark blue skirt, a union suit of underwear, a pair of tan, well-worn kid gloves, and new black and blue stockings. Since the dress was made of such a cheap material, and proximity of the crime to Fort Thomas, it was quickly assumed that the woman must be one of the sex workers that so frequently visited soldiers at the fort. It was even hypothesized that a group of soldiers stationed there could have committed the gruesome crime. The shoes were a size 3, and the bottom read Lewis Hayes, Greencastle, Indiana, 22.11.62, 428. The sales record tracked back to a 22-year-old named Miss Pearl Bryan of Greencastle, Indiana. The Bryan family was an old one, well respected in the community, and, at the time, was the largest family in Indiana. Mr. and Mrs. Bryan had 12 children, but only 7 were still living, Pearl being the youngest. Pearl was a bright young lady, graduating from Greencastle High School in 1892, with highest honors. It was said of her, quote, "She had many admirers, and to look on her was to love was to lose. She counted her admirers by the score, but to none did she give her heart, or encourage them in any serious intentions." The police were still skeptical when they arrived at the Bryan house with some of the dress's fabric. The family was wealthy, and the officers were doubtful that their daughter would be wearing such a cheap material. Alas, when the garment was pulled out, Mrs. Bryan wept uncontrollably, screaming, "My Pearl, my Pearl." The police were told that the dress had belonged to her dead sister and had been given to Pearl. When the police recounted an odd webbing between the victim's toes, Pearl's sister spoke up in shock that they had teased Pearl about it when they were young. A scar on Pearl's right hand, 2 gold hairpins, and 2 auburn rubber pins found at the scene served as extra confirmation. The body was positively identified as Pearl Bryan. Meanwhile, the manager for the Western Union Telegraph Company in Greencastle, a Mr. A.W. Early, had put the pieces together about the identity of the body, but also of her potential killer or killers. After hastening to tell his suspicions to the officers who were still in Greencastle, Scott Jackson, Alonzo Walling, and William Wood were arrested and charged with the murder of Pearl Bryan. Who are these men? I'll take you through a crash course of the 3 and how they met, beginning in late 1894. Scott Jackson and his mother moved to Greencastle, Indiana from Jersey City, New Jersey. Jackson quickly charmed the community, but how was the general public of Greencastle to know that Jackson had narrowly dodged an embezzlement case of $32,000 from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company by pinning it all on his partner in crime? Since he wasn't arrested and hadn't been successfully convicted, along with the limits of 1894 technology, Jackson was free to start over anywhere. His family had good financial and social standing, and his appearance attracted much attention from the town's young women, quote, with dimples on his chin and cheeks, a childish smile on his lips, frank, beautiful, pale violet blue eyes. He had a most winsome countenance. Scott Jackson became fast friends with William Wood, the third man arrested for Pearl Bryan's murder. The shocking part of this is that Will Wood was Pearl's second cousin, and they were extremely close. Will Wood introduced Jackson to the Bryan family in the spring of 1895. Despite having turned down multiple suitors in the past, Pearl and Jackson fell into what was described as love at first sight. Over the coming months, no one knew of any potential cracks in the relationship between Pearl and Jackson. Mr. and Mrs. Bryan were getting on in years and trusted Jackson's social standing. Will Wood knew his second cousin was infatuated, but he greatly underestimated the amount of power that Jackson had over her. Jackson began to attend dental college in Cincinnati, so he wasn't in Greencastle very often and therefore didn't need to work as hard to maintain his favorable reputation in the community. Pearl became pregnant and, in desperation, confided in her cousin Will Wood. It would be through the telegram exchanges between Jackson and Will that telegraph manager A.W. Early would gain clues of the crime that would transpire. Early told police that Jackson had been furious at the news. Jackson had admitted to intimate relations with Pearl in the telegraphs, as well as sending, quote, recipes calculated to prevent the evil results of their indiscretion. Jackson asked Will Wood to administer these concoctions to Pearl. While it is unknown whether or not Will slipped these to Pearl secretly or if she took them willingly, the result was still the same: no miscarriage. When Wood told Jackson that the efforts had failed, Jackson relayed a plan to Wood: that Pearl should come to Cincinnati, where Jackson could set up an abortion with a nice elderly woman in secret. Jackson even suggested that Pearl tell her parents that she would be visiting friends in Indianapolis, but to also bring money to cover traveling and other expenses. We now jump back to the investigation, right after Mr. Early had taken his information to the officers. After hearing about all of this, they brought Jackson into custody. Jackson immediately asked if they had also brought in Alonzo Walling yet. Who was Alonzo Walling? Well, we'll get to him later. Jackson denied having any substantial knowledge of the crime, only saying he had read a little about it in the paper. This was despite the police examining him and finding scratches on his right arm and spots of blood on the right sleeve of his undershirt, along with evidence of attempted removal of these blood spots. With a tangled web of details and multiple attempts to throw one another under the bus, things got very messy very fast between the three suspects. To summarize, the accusations were as follows. 1. Alonzo Walling claimed that, quote, Wood was the author of Pearl Bryan's ruin, that Wood had insisted on an abortion, which Jackson refused to do. 2. Scott Jackson claimed that Alonzo Walling killed Pearl to shelter William Wood, who had been Pearl's sweetheart. 3. William Wood seemed surprised at news of the murder in general. To his knowledge, Jackson was simply organizing an abortion. When Wood discussed the abortion plans with Pearl, she seemed relieved. And what's more, Will stated that he had never met Alonzo Walling. Like I said, messy. Let's go back to Alonzo Walling, who at the time of the crime was only 19. He was born on a farm near Mount Carmel, Indiana. His father passed away when he was 3, leaving Mrs. Walling to be a single parent of 3 young boys. When Alonzo was 13, the family moved to Greencastle, where the young teen worked in a glass factory for 4 years until it closed. His mother sacrificed a good deal of what they had in order for Alonzo to attend dental college, becoming one of the top students in his class. But this was also where he met Scott Jackson. In the police interview, Alonzo told detectives that Jackson had told him that Pearl had become pregnant via William Wood, and that, quote, he must get rid of her. Jackson had suggested they simply kill Pearl in a room and leave her there. On second thought, Jackson supposedly said, quote, it would not do to leave her there, so I will instead cut her to pieces and drop the pieces in different vaults around town. If the next part is true, then Jackson was not nearly the nefarious criminal mastermind that he thought he was. Walling and Jackson went to Wallingford's saloon, where Jackson asked a group of medical students what poison would kill the quickest. He was informed that hydrocyanic or prussic acid was their pick, but that cocaine was the next best choice. Jackson promptly purchased cocaine at Colby's drugstore on 6th Street. Even after giving this condemning information, Alonzo told police that he had taken the coat that Jackson had worn when he murdered Pearl, and at Jackson's request, had thrown it down a sewer at the corner of Richmond and John Streets. When detectives followed up on this information, they did indeed find the black coat wrapped in newspaper. Quote, on the lining of the sleeves were found bloodstains, and in one of the pockets, a lot of tansy flower, which, made into tea, is used to produce miscarriages. That alone is pretty damning. But even more evidence was to follow. So much evidence that an argument could almost be made that maybe Jackson didn't really care if he was caught. Saloon keeper John Kugel burst into the clerk Vickers' office carrying a suitcase belonging to Jackson and a brown leather satchel, the sides stained heavily with blood. When confronted with the bag, Jackson said that, sure, it had contained the head, but that Walling had carried it. He also supposed that the head must be in the river, making every attempt to sound non-committal, never truly confirming it. Eventually, Jackson did admit that he had disposed of a skirt, a petticoat, some stockings, and several other items in the river. Jackson's locker at the Ohio Dental College was searched, and God only knows what made him think it was a good idea to hide a pair of trousers covered in dried mud and blood at his own school. Jackson quickly claimed that the trousers belonged to Walling. On the night of the murder, multiple witnesses saw Pearl, Jackson, and Walling getting drinks at Wallingford's Saloon in downtown Cincinnati. Jackson ordered a whiskey for himself and a sarsaparilla for Pearl, this being where many theorize that Jackson may have drugged her drink. The autopsy revealed that there was enough cocaine in Pearl's system to render her unconscious, further supported by Jackson's purchase at Colby's drugstore. The last clue in a long parade of incriminating evidence was a hat found on the side of the road in Newport that was identified as Pearl's by her sister. It had been weighed down with a stone and wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, which was identified as belonging to Jackson. At the trial, a Mr. Trusty claimed to have driven a cab that picked up Pearl, Alonzo, and Jackson, but that Pearl was already dead. He was told that an abortion had been attempted and failed, that Jackson and Walling had been charged with her body. I would be inclined to believe that this testimony was a concoction for a snippet of fame. No one would be dumb enough to bring their intended murder victim in front of a witness, Mr. Trusty, claiming that the victim was already dead. But then again, we've already seen how intelligent Jackson's choices have been. If this did happen, I would guess that she was already drugged with cocaine. However, I can't account for why they would claim that she was already dead. Why wouldn't they give another reason why she was unconscious? Why create a witness for yourselves? These are questions that no one can answer now. However, if this evidence from the cabbie is true, it is significant as it puts both men as active in the participation of this murder. The only noteworthy attempt for someone to come to Jackson's defense was his landlady, Miss Rose McNevin. She testified that Jackson hadn't left the home at the night of the murder, that she, quote, always knew when her 14 roomers were at home. Needless to say, Jackson and Walling were both found guilty of Pearl's murder. But the story still has one last wild card to play. In a last, desperate attempt, the mayor, the police chief and the sheriff brought Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling into a room. When they opened the door, there lay Pearl's headless body in an open coffin. One of Pearl's brothers and one of her sisters was standing on either side of the casket. Jackson nervously fidgeted, eyes darting to and away from the body, shaking his head and sighing. Walling just stared blankly at the body, the only betrayal of nervousness being his foot tapping on the floor. When asked if they recognized the body, Walling said that it must be Pearl, as Jackson had told him so. Before the body of their baby sister, the family begged for them to reveal the location of her head. Both men coldly denied any knowledge of anything. At 7:35 a.m., Reverend Lee prayed with the condemned men, singing, "God be with you till we meet again." Walling received a note from his girlfriend that said, "Die game," which means die bravely. Extreme measures were deemed necessary to ensure that crowd justice wouldn't be enacted in transit from Cincinnati to Newport. But they did sell tickets to the 11:30 a.m. hanging, to be carried out on the newly built gallows behind the Newport courthouse. 3 minutes before the men were set to hang, Jackson told Sheriff Plummer that he had a confession. Jackson wrote a telegram to the governor reading, "Walling is not guilty of this crime, I am." This confession would prove fruitless, as when the mayor asked Jackson why Walling was innocent, Jackson replied, "I can't say that. That's a trap. I can't say that without admitting I was there." Now, the urban legend version of the Bobby Mackey story goes that the men raged at the crowd, shouting that they would haunt the area, cursing the people forever. However, I could find nothing of the sort in the historical record of the event. What I did find was the recorded last words of the condemned men. Jackson's last words were, quote, "I only have this to say, that I'm not guilty of the crime for which I am now compelled to pay the penalty of my life." Alonzo Walling's last words were, "Nothing, only that you are taking the life of an innocent man, and I will call upon God to witness the truth of what I say." Jackson sang hymns, including "The Sweet By and By," until the trapdoor dropped at 11:40 a.m. Unfortunately for the pair, the ropes were too short to give them a clean break. It took 3 minutes for Jackson to die, 4 minutes for Walling. And so ended the last public hanging in Newport. At the same time as this case, various newspapers reported that a few heads were discovered around Newport, including one found buried and one that washed up on the banks of the Ohio River. Besides the concern that multiple heads were turning up in such a small area, none of them were positively identified as Pearl, and her head was unfortunately never found. Pearl's body was kept at Forest Hill Cemetery for almost 7 weeks, as her father was determined not to lay her to rest without her head. Eventually, the family managed to convince him to allow the burial to commence. On the 27th of March, 1896, Pearl was dressed in her cream white silk gown and satin slippers that she had worn to her high school graduation. That these were the nice clothes that she owned unintentionally emphasizes just how young this young woman really was. Her classmates carried her casket, which bore the engraved silver plate that read only Pearl. Her grave sat at the cemetery's highest point, so that their daughter would have a view of her family's home. As time passed, people yet again proved to be as selfishly disrespectful as they had with her place of death. 2 headstones had to be removed and replaced, as so many people had chipped pieces from them as souvenirs. Now there's only a headstone base. Those with more sympathy in their hearts leave pennies at the base, specifically with the head side up in the hopes that her head will be found now or in the afterlife. When it comes to the potential connection to Bobby Mackey's location, in the first episode of Ghost Adventures, they interview author Douglas Hensley, who tells the team that the bloodhounds tracked the killers directly to Bobby Mackey's. This version of events supports the theory that Jackson and Alonzo disposed of Pearl's head down the well in the basement of the distillery. Some theories push this even further, speculating that Jackson and Alonzo had conducted satanic rituals in the tunnel with Pearl's remains. In all of my digging, I found no evidence of this. When referring to the bloodhounds, the historical text documents that the confused scents led to 20 men in jail due to the crime scene's contamination. The closest solid lead that the bloodhounds found was a scent that led to the Covington Reservoir. In the hopes of finding the missing head, the reservoir was drained at the expense of $2,000 to reveal nothing. All in all, I don't think there is a direct connection between the building and the Pearl Bryan case. I know it isn't the most thrilling answer in the world, but I just don't see any evidence to affix the event and this location. After viewing all of the evidence I could find, and reading the accounts from the time of the events, I believe that the murder of Pearl Bryan was an attempt to erase anything that would tie a selfish young man to his own actions. He was used to being able to flee from his mistakes, pinning someone else with any lingering responsibilities, and start over. He tried to do the same thing here, utilizing another young man to get rid of his own evidence and to take the fall. There was testimony of Jackson flitting around to see a variety of young women in Indianapolis while under an assumed name so that he could return to Greencastle and play the dashing heartthrob to a wealthy girl with a powerful family. From the account of the events, it seems that Alonzo Walling was an easily manipulated young man who was either eager to do whatever Jackson wished, or was too afraid of Jackson to defy him. This being said, he still participated in the concealment of evidence and potentially assisted in the transportation of Pearl's unconscious body, so he seems in no way truly innocent. William Wood strikes me as a man who loved his cousin, but through that love was coerced to influence her. Records show that Wood and Jackson got up to quite a bit of mischief together in various nearby towns and cities, and I don't doubt that Jackson's company felt like a thrill, but it blinded him to just how far Jackson would go to continue the life he wanted. And Pearl underwent an encounter so horrifying that many don't fully retell it. From what I read of descriptions recorded by those who knew her, she was a cheerful, intelligent, beloved young lady, if not potentially a little sheltered and naive, who put her trust in the wrong man. It makes me uncomfortable that for years, many recountings simply remember her as a head thrown down a well, instead of a girl with barely any experience of the world outside of her home, who was terrified of the consequences of a potentially little understood relationship. I say that not to diminish her intelligence, but more to realize that, with Jackson having so many faces, she did not truly know her partner. Though the murder is now a keystone of Bobby Mackey lore, there is still no tangible evidence that it was connected in any way. Even so, many ghost hunters have claimed to see either Pearl or her murderers at the site, some even arguing that they now function as harbingers of evil. It's also important to note that the building was a functioning distillery at the time of the murder. It would be nearly impossible to dispose of a body part without it being discovered. In light of this, the theory of Bobby Mackey's connection to the Pearl Bryan murder has changed in recent years. As my own tour group gathered near the front door of Bobby Mackey's, our tour guide said that now people theorize that Pearl's head was instead thrown into a furnace at the distillery, hence eliminating the evidence before it could be discovered. While a fascinating evolution of the theory, it feels more like trying to fit a narrative to the facts. The distillery building was later abandoned, and soon rumors began to cycle of satanic cults, of human and animal sacrifice. From what I could find, it was only after the murder that stories of satanic cults began to pop up, retroactively placing Jackson and Walling as active participants. The murder and trial contained so many sensational details that we frequently see immortalized in culture. A doomed relationship, a beautiful woman of good social standing cruelly betrayed, a grisly murder, and a major missing element. It doesn't take much to arrange these pieces over the years to neatly fit into an eternally feared, yet ambiguous, satanic cult narrative. Despite being so certain of the location of her missing head, it's never been found. Because it's never been found, it leaves a little bit of room for people to insist that it was disposed of on the property, therefore permanently entombing the spirits in a creepy building with a long history of violence. No matter what I say, I'm aware that this story will continue to live on, but I do hope that by shedding light on the evidence collected, that the facts may be revived, in addition to the memory of a well-loved girl gone too soon. One major story now told, in the next episode we'll skip forward to a much different time. Alcohol became illegal, making an opportunity for lucrative, though illicit, business practices. Where there's money, there's crime. No group being as feared as the mob. Next week, we'll go over why the mob so desperately wanted to get its hands on Bobby Mackey's.